so much for coming today. It's such a beautiful day. And we know everyone has busy lives and different things to do, so we're so grateful for your fellowship being here at the Home to the Art of Canada. So I want to start by saying the McMichael Canadian Art Collection is located on the original lands of the Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat people. Today, this land is the territory of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. It is uniquely situated along the Carrying Place Trail, which historically provided an integral connection for Indigenous people between Ontario's lakeshore and the Lake Simcoe Georgian Bay region. You would have seen when you came up here, as you turned the corner to come up the ramp, the beautiful ceremonial pipe fragments that are on display at the bottom of the ramp. And those are from a community that was about a 3-minute drive from here, down just off the 400, that had about 3,000 people living there 500 years ago. And it was along the Carrying Place Trail, which is at the bottom of the bluff here, that, as I say, connected, that was a major trading route through this part of Southern Ontario, what is now Southern Ontario. So we're in a very special place here, a very, very soulful place, and we're very proud and pleased to continue to draw people's sensitivity to the original inhabitants of this region. You see that this gallery is hung with works by, principally by works by Norval Morrisseau, a great Ojibwe artist, Anishinaabe artist who was great friends with our founders and used to come here and carouse with Mr. McMichael and make paintings in the Thompson Shack after it first arrived. So there's lots of vibes here. The woman of the hour today is Sandra Paikowsky, who is my dear friend and colleague. We got into a conversation some years ago about her borrowing some scans of Maurice's works that are in our collection, and I said, of course, you could have those, and what a wonderful idea, Maurice in Venice, who's doing the book, and who's doing the show? And she said, well, there's a book, but there's no show, and that was the first spark that lit the fire that led us to Maurice in Venice. Sandra is a Canadian art historian, a very distinguished one, an academic, a curator, and writer whose career spans 5 decades. Hard to believe, but it is the case. She's a professor emerita at Concordia University, and she was the longtime editor and publisher of the Journal of Canadian Art History, and was appointed to the Order of Canada in 2015 for her significant contributions to the development of Canadian art history as a discipline. There was a time 30 years ago when art historians in training would be told by their teachers and advisors, don't do Canadian art, there's no jobs in that, go and learn about Botticelli. And it was people like Sandra and Dennis Reed and others who we remember fondly who said, hell no, we're not going to put up with that. So she's a fighter. From 1981 to 1992, Sandra served as the director and curator of the Concordia Art Gallery, making many extraordinary exhibitions and fostering the talent of many others. Among her many publications, recent texts focus on Montreal women abstract painters, modernism in Canadian representational art, art institutions in the Maritimes, and James Wilson Morrice's Paintings of Venice. And she is just in the middle, on the precipice of launching another marvelous exhibition at the Beaverbrook Art Gallery of her late husband, John Fox, who was a very great Montreal painter, who sadly gone ahead to mix the drinks, but you're keeping the flame alive. And she goes from the McMichael out to New Brunswick to continue her great work, and who knows what she has in store. She has a few ideas. We've talked about it at lunch already. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sandra Paikowsky. I'll be just chatting with her up here.
Thank you. It's a real kick to be here. I enjoy naturally talking, and I really like talking about James Wilson Morrice. And I would like to thank Sarah and the staff here for putting on what I think is one of the most magnificent installations of any exhibition I've ever seen. This exhibition is an honor, and is an honor to James Wilson Morrice and his time in Venice. And the McMichael has done just
thank you.
Perfect job. This is the first exhibition and publication that is solely dedicated to James Wilson Morrice. He was born in Montreal. from an extremely wealthy family, which was good because it gave him the money to be an artist. He did come to Toronto and trained to be at U of T, trained to be a lawyer, passed the bar exam, and never looked back. At law, that is. In 1890, he goes to Paris. And like every North American with ambitions to be a modern artist, he went to Paris. He studied a bit, but mainly he worked on his own. As far as we know, in 1894, he made his first trip to Venice. On the left, there's a wonderful photograph by the famous Notman photographer of Montreal in the exhibition, but here's two slightly different ones. The one on the left is maybe, probably, pretty likely, and undoubtedly is Morrice as a young man holding his beloved flute. And he refers to playing the flute, and particularly playing Bach on his flute. And it seems to me that when I look at his paintings, I see musical sheets in terms of the annotation, the way that the rhythm of his paintings. And this presumably is in his parents' home, which, even though it's been torn down, is, and if you know Montreal at all, it's around the corner from the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, or it was. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but we'll pretend it is. On the right is a photograph of Morrice in his Paris studio residence, probably around 1910, which would date it about the time that he makes his last visit, his possible last visit to Venice. The photograph that's in the exhibition is circa 1900, when he was most definitely in Venice. Why Venice? Well, the answer is why not? Everybody and every artist and their grandmother was in Venice in the late 19th to the early 20th century. And there's funny, little stories of people saying, look behind a tree and out will pop a painter. The two big, of course, influence for a North American artist or British artist would be Canaletto, of course, and his views, which are very realistic, although slightly idealistic, of the Vicino San Marco. I picked one that maybe you can go and see, because it's the Art Gallery of Ontario from the 18th century. And Canaletto was like the main, was very, very well known to painters outside of Italy, because so many of his pictures were in Britain and eventually in the States. The other big influence for artists closer in age to Morrice, of course, was Whistler. And Whistler was to painters of Maurice's generation like Cézanne was to the next generation, an all-abiding presence. I particularly chose this pastel because while Whistler's influence is noted in Maurice's paintings in terms of the softness, the lightness, similarity of colors, etc., etc. What I think he really got from Whistler was the use of, in particularly the pastels, of using pastel on colored paper. It's just ordinary junky craft paper. But that the paper shows through, and I think this is where Whistler's important for Morrice, because what you'll see in the exhibition, the majority of Maurice's paintings of Venice are wood on panel, and wood panels, oil on wood panel, and he lets that wood show through in the same way that Whistler lets the paper show through. So they become part of the surface, and there's almost no difference between the color and the surface that is painted on. But Whistler was terribly important in so many ways, and it's quite likely that they did know each other. I firmly believe It's sort of like confession. I firmly believe that Morrice is the first Canadian modernist painter. And the definition of modernist painting can be seen, I think, quite clearly, or for me it's pretty clear, in this painting of Venice at the Golden Hour from the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. P.S. The Venice at the Golden Hour is a made-up title. In a million years, Morrice would never have anything that romantic, particularly because modernist painters were not interested in any kind of title that made you feel something, that made you react to the painting. So that's why most of Maurice's paintings are called Venice. Or
It's
in
not
French,
very helpful when you're
Venise,
trying to do
or
scholarship.
Venice in the evening,
Yeah.
or Venice in the daytime. So it's a nightmare if you try to figure out, or I tried to figure out, what paintings he showed when, because every painting was called Venice. This is most likely a line from a novel by Henry James. However, to get back to why it's a modernist painting, one of the simplest definitions of modernist painting is absolutely nothing happens. There's no story. It's just it's everyday life, what you see, but what you see kind of in a glance. And what you see for the moment. In a picture like this, the man, and that's not a gondola, that's a sandalo, and he's rowing it correctly with crossed wrists, is there for the moment, but he'll be gone, because they can be quite speedy. And he's aiming towards the Rialto Bridge, which you don't see. One of the second aspects, for instance, of modernist painting is cropping. So you never see things in their entirety. It's closer to the way that you actually see. We crop, without thinking, we see glimpses, we see things in the moment. So here, the building, building to the right of what is now and has been forever the Hotel Rialto, because those are the steps on the left to the Rialto Bridge, continues on. You know it continues on. So it's just a glimpse. And this cropping is central to modernist painting. At the same time, and I think I sort of used the word central accidentally, there's nothing in the center of the painting. Traditionally, the most important thing in the picture is in the middle. In true modernist painting, nothing, whatever happens to be at the mathematical or arithmetical center of the painting is usually nothing. And in this case, it's kind of a wall, a bit of a wall. And that ends up with being two things, making it momentary, but also making it more familiar. Because Venice is a city of monuments, which is why everybody's so unhappy with the recent wedding that's happened there, which we won't discuss. But he takes these monuments, and I'll get to that a bit more, and makes them familiar. The other thing, it's very much his viewpoint. We know exactly where he's standing. In this case, he was sitting at a bar in front of what is now the Hotel Marconi. And so we're seeing Venice the way he saw Venice, with as much as he chooses to show you and as much as he chooses, in a sense, not to show you.
Which is such a strong contrast to the canaletto that you showed earlier, where every flag on every mast of every ship is detailed into forensic detail. And also it's all about the grand view, where this is so much about the intimate moment.
There's almost no grand views, and the other aspect is within that glimpse, when he paints architecture, it's absolutely perfect. If there's 7 windows, he paints 7 windows. His appreciation of Venetian architecture is that of an architect. So it's always extremely, extremely accurate, although you only know that if you set out to prove that it's accurate.
Which you have.
Because he just makes it convincing
Yeah.
without it. He doesn't hit you over the head. Canaletto kind of hits you over the head, but he doesn't.
Yeah, it kind of looks like it's sketchy, but it kind of looks like it's sketchy, but
Yes.
it's extremely
This
detailed.
actually is where it all started for me in terms of Morrice. I mean, I've taught Canadian art history and I would mention Morrice. But my first trip to Venice, which became an annual expedition in 1977, was staying very near the Rialto Bridge and the Rialto Hotel. And what became kind of, because so much of Venice looks now, and exactly the same way that it looked when Morrice was there, was that big question of what's art? And what is, when you have something that is so accurate and so real, where's the art part?
Well, because photography had come along and made
Yes.
verisimilitude wasn't the be-all and the end-all of a
Yes.
sudden, too, and
Yeah.
also gave the cropping idea
Yes.
to painting, you know.
And that's what really intrigued me about seeing something that was so well preserved, but what did he look at and what was he trying to do with it? And the other, which is my big discovery, this is probably, aside from being one of his most famous, if not his most famous painting of Venice, personally, the painting that's been written about the most. But fine, and I thought, what am I going to say about it now? However, it dawned on me as I'm looking at this, and with the panel study that goes with it, which is in the exhibition, is that there's a shadow across the front of the Rialto Hotel, and it's a nice shadow. In fact, it's probably the shadow of the Rialto Bridge, which would be to the right. So that was my big discovery, and then I thought, let's go, you know. This is all
Because
too
the study
real.
was made when the sun was more overhead, so there's no shadow in the study. But when he goes back to Paris, he then thinks,
Yeah.
let's make it the end of day. Let's
Yes.
do something more
Exactly,
atmospheric. you know?
Exactly. One of the things that makes Maurice different from so many of the other, even modernist painters, French modernist painters, for example, who came to Venice, is he's very interested in Venetians. And he includes Venetians in his picture, not just as staffage or, you know, to fill in the space, but they have a function. And their function is that they are as much a part of Venice as the architecture is. And they also symbolically separate him as the outsider from the Venetians who've been there at this point for 1,500, you know, or close over 1,500 years. The way that he worked, doink, starts with his sketchbooks. And the majority of the sketchbooks that we have are fortunately at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. The National Gallery of Canada has one in particular that's called the Venice-Paris Sketchbook, and it's filled with goodies. The sketchbooks, which are like half the size of a 8 by 10 piece of paper, he uses them constantly. He draws constantly. This is an example, for instance, of the study for Park, which is really the public gardens, the paintings in the exhibition, and this is the drawing. And you can see how very close it is. He makes a certain amount of shifts. The woman in white takes up more space in the painting than she does in the drawing. And he'll turn his sketchbook depending on whether he wants a horizontal or a vertical image. And this was his most standard way of painting. The problem is, for me anyway, is there's not enough sketchbooks. Too many have either been lost, thrown in the garbage, or are out there somewhere, because there's so many paintings that don't have drawings, as well as the fact that we should have at least 3 times as many sketchbooks as we have. Sometimes we have drawings that have maybe a sketchbook drawings that may relate to a painting or may not. Both of these are in the exhibition. This is Venetian Girl, also called Symphony in Pink for kind of obvious reasons, and maybe even his title, but I don't think so. And this drawing of a woman in a decorative shawl, the woman is of the lowest economic class in Venice, who are referred to as a popolana. And they were the majority of Venetians. And here, he does something very common. He has in his sketchbooks, there's many, many drawings of popolana. I think in this one, which is probably the model for that, he flips her. Now, that's the oldest trick in the artist's handbook, but he's in Venice. And looking at Venetian paintings, Renaissance Venetian painting, particularly Tintoretto, who's the only Venetian painter who he mentions in his sketchbook. And Tintoretto in the 16th century was the master of the flip picture, the flipped figure. So when you look at one of his paintings, which probably has like 60 people in them, 30 of them are probably just in a reverse pose of something else. So this is a direct or indirect look at Tintoretto, or maybe not at all.
You mentioned to me too that you can tell that they're these working class women because the hairstyle. They
Yes.
have a bun on top of their head, whereas
Yes.
and it's interesting, he's almost exclusively painting popolana. You really don't see more than one or two downstairs ladies with big hats, which would have been the
Yes.
tourists, because they always
Yes.
were covering themselves from the sun.
And the few times he doesn't paint tourists very often.
Yeah, he's
but
really
if he
trying to
does
embed
paint
himself.
a tourist,
Yeah.
if he does paint a woman, if he paints a foreigner, she's wearing a
Wearing a
hat. Normally the popolana that he paints and the way they're shown in photographs, they're wearing rather drab black shawls. But that's not exactly 100% true because it's true to reality because an unmarried popolana could wear fancy stuff. And there was a certain vogue, if that's the word, they take used pieces of cloth and tack them together and end up having something that was a little bit better than those drab gray and brown and gray things. So
She's definitely
she's a
strutting her-
little
strutting her stuff there.
she's a little on the Chanel Dior side, but she's still legit to be wearing something of this color. The panels are, as I say, the most numerous of all of his Venetian pictures, and in some cases they were developed into canvases. Why some became canvases and others didn't is no way of knowing. The panels are generally finished and complete pictures, which he exhibited. And the reason he exhibited panels, not as studies, but as legitimate, quote-unquote, paintings, was because Whistler had already done it. So this is another aspect of Whistler's influence on Morrice. And here, they have the McMichael study for Port of Venice, and then the Montreal Museum's canvas. In this case, there's very little difference between them. Things are obviously a little bit more refined, more finished in the canvas than they are in the panel. But and this is almost the norm. There are a few examples when the panel is quite different, or somewhere between being not different and quite different. And in the exhibition, there's a few examples of a study and a canvas, which does show how they moved, in a sense, from one or the other. In fact, when Morrice showed his panels, they were often written about as being perfect within themselves, and others writing about the canvases said, well, really what they are his panels that are jewels that twinkle. And he was complimented by the critics. He got very good critical reviews, by the way, in Paris, particularly, for his ability to move from a panel to a canvas. When you see the show, the size is very different. I mean, the panels are little. The average is sort of 6 by 5 inches, and the canvas is average is 25 by 20 inches. So that's a huge move, but the magic rests in the fact that they don't lose anything in this translation of size. They have as much joy, they have as much particularity, and they have as much inner life, whether they're panels or whether they're canvases. Sometimes we have paintings that we don't know anything about. So, Woman at a Cafe, which is the poster for this exhibition, used as the poster for the exhibition. There's no drawing and there's no canvas. The panels were painted in Venice, just as the drawings obviously were made in situ. So it is possible that he never made a drawing for it, and then that's it. And then sometimes I think he did work on the panels a little bit later, maybe back in his hotel or wherever he stayed in Venice, because we have no idea where he stayed. And maybe even worked on the bit when he went back to Paris. The canvases are definitely painted in Paris, for a very simple and practical reason. Painting a canvas requires a whole lot of paraphernalia. And it's just much simpler if you want to work in oil, and you want that sensuality of oil, is to do it on panel. The other thing about oil on panel is that it takes a bit longer to dry. And so you can manipulate it. If he saw something he painted something in the afternoon, he wasn't so crazy about it that night, he could change it because the paint hadn't dried.
Or something like
Oddly,
watercolor, you're done.
Yes.
It sets on the, yeah.
What is strange, though, is that there's no watercolors. He did a few watercolors before he went to Venice. He did late watercolors. And watercolor is actually the most, of all of the mediums for painting Venice by a traveler, or in his, a visitor, is watercolor, because all you need is paper, water, and a cup of water, and you just dunk your cup in the canal and some paint, and you're off. And he didn't, for whatever reason.
You shared with me something absolutely fascinating when we were working on the extended labels for the show, is that, and this is a good example of like maybe why he didn't, use watercolor, is that he worked extremely deliberately, like the accounts of people describing watching Morrice paint. It looks like it was painted like super fast because it has such freshness and a feeling of spontaneity. But actually, you were telling me he's incredibly methodical. He would put a paint stroke down and then he would think about it and then put another one down. So you can't really paint that way with watercolor.
No, he painted, the descriptions of him painting was being, as you say, very, very careful. And that he's smoked a pipe. And he would have a puff and smoking a pipe is a long, complicated business, because my late husband did it, and it just took for hours. Anyway, so you have to pack the pipe, you have to blah, 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 the tobacco. So you take
It's a ritual.
and then he'd put it down, and then he this is Morrice, not John, and he would pick up the brush, and then he'd make a few strokes, and then he'd repeat the process. Here, for instance, is an example of where we know exactly where he is. He's just the next table, and the woman is staring at him. Now, people have attempted, not people, there's been a certain attempt to wonder about who is she. She's not his longtime companion, Leah Cadoret, because does Leah look better than this? Also, there's nothing that suggested that Leah ever went to Venice with him. He was very great friends with the American Joseph Pinnell. It's thought maybe this was Pinnell's wife, which doesn't make sense because she wasn't with him. That's pretty much 1901, and Mrs. Pinnell was not with Mr. Pinnell when they all went to Venice with Maurice at that time. So whoever she is, she's got her eye out for Maurice. And she's obviously aware that he's looking at her because she's looking right back.
And she gives him, he gives her that bright red lipstick too, that
Yes.
tiny little hit
Yeah,
there. that
it's a
just-
very, and he gives you so little information on one hand, but he gives you so much information at the same time. Her gesture, the turn of her head, her costume, by the way, suggests, it's kind of that hat and the black dress, is that she's an upper level Popolana, which means she had some kind of a job and very likely was a companion to foreign women travelers, while the young woman in the middle of the picture is very much a Popolana. But again, nothing, no studies, no drawings, no canvas. And similarly with old palaces, which is an image, they're all old palaces, and they're not palaces. A palazzo, this is Sandra's lecture, a palazzo is not a palace. It is a big building which was used, built, constructed by the original, one of, the members of the original nobility, who were never called nobility, they were just known to be, they were the wealthiest class of Venetians. They were the quote-unquote original Venetians, and the buildings that they constructed were for the whole family. So there would be generations as well as close relatives living in the upper floors. The lower floors were used for their businesses, which was mainly import-export. Right? So
The working buildings
Yeah.
at the ground level, and they have
So-
these water entries
Yeah.
on the canal side, but often then a little pedestrian entry exit at the far side of the building that you can
Yes.
see from the,
And the Cadamosto was then and still continues to be the most famous one because above the line of windows are Byzantine relief sculpture. And this is about all that's left of Venice, and I know there were hundreds of. But again, it's a perfect example of Maurice's cropping, where you see only three, you don't see the top of the building at all, but you do see the huge water door, and the facade that's on the water is the main facade of the building. And the water door where you went in your gondola or your sandalo or your whatever was the entrance into the palazzo. There, by the way, are also even though these are two panels, there are canvases and several in this exhibition where there's no drawing and no panel, or at least none that are known. So as soon as we think we know something about Maurice, we know how much we don't know about Maurice, if that makes sense. Now, what did he do with the monuments in this city of monuments? On the left is St. Mark's Basilica, but he painted at least 7 pictures of San Marco. But he never shows the whole building. Sometimes the most you get is 3 floors, and you almost always get the front door and the main portal. In this one, you do get the horses, which are above the main portal, but everything else has been cropped. Part of it is because he's sitting at one of the famous cafes, and he's looking straight ahead, and this is what he sees. I sat at that cafe, and it cost me $25 to have a cup of espresso, but that's another story, what you do for the sake of art. But this is how he makes probably one of the most famous buildings in the world be familiar and almost casual, and it's the glimpse. The people walking in front are probably Venetians, It's possibly it's Sunday. We don't know. It's in the mid-afternoon. We know that because the main door is closed and won't open again till later for the evening. And then sitting on the base of the flagpole are ordinary Venetians. So it's here he's showing just everyday street life that goes on in the context of one of the most famous buildings in the world. Similarly, in the adjacent Piazzetta, which is right beside the Piazza San Marco, is probably the second most famous building in Venice, the Doge's Palace. Only once does he show 3/4 of it, but again, very much at an angle from sitting at a bar in the Piazza San Marco. And here he crops this huge, enormous building, so you only see the two arches. His interest is the people who is the building, but how the Popolana who live in Venice, who are the same Venetians who are upset with that wedding, occupied the city. This is their place. This is their city. And as a little kind of humorous thing, the two Popolano walk in the direction of San Marco, and they have those ever-present pigeons walking alongside with them. The other thing that Morrice does here, which is something he does in so many of the pictures, is he gives you a close-up view and a distant view at the same time. So along the side, you see the main promenade called the Riva degli Schiavoni that continues all the way east to basically the end of Venice. So you get a distant view and a close-up view. Morrice's pictures, Morrice had an artist, he was the art historian, you want to wring his neck. He never dated anything. So no painting, nothing. There's no dates on drawings. Everything is kind of based on when he could have been there, because we're not exactly sure when he was there, and guesses, good guesses. This one isn't too hard. We know it was before 1905 because the church in the background, which is Vivaldi's church, by the way, is covered in red stucco. In 1905, it was covered in white marble. So we date the painting, this is what art historians do. You date the painting based on the color of a church. In another picture, for instance, also of the Ducal Palace, we know it was before July 12, 1902, because he paints the shadow of the bell tower of San Marco. He never paints the bell tower, but he paints the shadow. The Campanile collapsed July 12th at 9 o'clock in the morning in 1902. Ergo, we know that Morrice's painting had to be right before that. And that's about as far as we know. Other Venice monuments, and one of the most famous, of course, is the Rialto Bridge. The Rialto Bridge was the first, not this version, was the first bridge to cross the Grand Canal. And there's only, well, as of about 10 years ago, there's only 4 that cross the Grand Canal. Meanwhile, there's like, I was going to say 400, but it's pretty close to that, small bridges that cross all the other canals. But here, it's an extremely accurate rendition in terms of the architectural details, of the bridge at the Rialto, but he puts it in the background. So it's there. It's the only time he ever paints the whole thing, but it's not up front. So again, it's part of that lived daily experience of Venice by Venetians. And in the front, a motif that he uses a lot, which is an older woman, usually a Popolana, who seems to be a nursemaid, a maid, a caretaker, or whatever, to a young girl who seems to always wears pink dresses, pink frothy dresses, and he, it's possible he's interested in showing this young girl because he was very fond of his one and only and very little sister Annie. So whether he just, this is a little tribute to Annie, who knows? But it's a motif that he uses a lot. But again, the bridge is in the distance. And the fourth most famous monument in Venice is the Church of San Pietro di Castello. And it was the main church of Venice before, up until Napoleon shows up in 1797 and said San Marco was the basilica. But again, he puts it in the background, in the distance, so it's accurate, but it's not, the monument, in other words, is not monumentalized. In the front is a Sunday afternoon of Popolana, enjoying the day. Right now, very little has changed in Venice, but this is gone. And right now, it's sort of like a junkyard for old vaporetti, and it's just, you can't get close to it. But we know from written descriptions of the time that this was a very common and very happy place for people to spend Sunday afternoon. And physically, geographically, it's not that far from the public gardens where the Venice Biennale happens every couple of years. Another theme, which I've already hinted at before, is one of something that I call his canalscapes, where he will show, usually, but not always, buildings along the Grand Canal, which divides the city in two. On the left is the very storied Palazzo Dario, which, by the way, comes up for sale on a regular basis if you're interested in Venetian real estate.
Bezos.
And very famous for its Byzantine and marble stonework on the facade. Monet paints it, everybody painted it. We know he's there in the summer because the gondola has its summer covering, the red and white striped canopy. Normally, a gondola has a black box so that the Venetians could do what they wanted to do without anybody seeing. The tourists, who of course had completely invaded Venice by the 12th century, complained that if they were sitting inside the black box, they couldn't see anything. So the black box is removed, and the little striped canopy is its summer replacement. So while we don't know the exact dates when Morrice was there, we know in this case he was there in the summer. In terms of his exactitude, that's a perfect example of the Palazzo Dario. It's perfect. And also his rendering of the front of a gondola is perfect. It has six parts, and it refers to the 6 boroughs that make up the city of Venice. Another canalscape here this is the close-up. One of the things when he has 2 kinds, something like this, where there's buildings and the Grand Canal. The one time he's not exactly accurate, if you know where he's standing, is he fools around with the width of the Grand Canal, with the width of the water. Sometimes he makes it a little on the large side, other times he makes it too narrow. On the right, here, the buildings, in a painting with another typical Morrice title, Grand Canal, which tells you a lot, he's very interested in the architecture, but he shows both sides of the canal, which is quite rare. Here, this line of buildings, which is extremely famous, just down a little bit from the Rialto Bridge, is pushed to the back. while in the foreground is the quite a wide street called the Riva del Vin, because it's where the boats bringing wine would dock, because uh, the scuola, which is kind of like the confraternity of the wine merchants, had their warehouses on this street. And then in the foreground, he has men playing cards, maybe playing cards, which is another motif which he loves and shows up in your painting of a view of the main street of the island of Chioggia, which is in the Adriatic. Again, it's ordinary Venice with ordinary people. And so far, really, you've seen, except hidden under that canopy, you've seen no tourists. You've only seen Venetians. His next famous, most popular theme are promenades and walkways. Riva delle Schiavone, the Riva is the very, you saw it already in the image of the woman in the cafe, but is almost equivalent to the Champs-Élysées of Venice. All the huge hotels were then and still are all along the Riva. It's where it's the main sort of place that you promenaded and you went for your walk in Venice. That's where you were. You don't do it now unless you do it at 4 o'clock in the morning because there's 49 million people. But he never shows the whole Riva. In fact, sometimes he even shows it empty. And here it's a glimpse. Again, it's a glimpse. He's sitting at the Cafe Internazionale. He looks across. It's the Church of the Redentore on the across the St. Mark's Basin, and with the Popolana coming down the stairs. So in all of the paintings, and this is again part of his modernism, is the sense of movement and eminent change, that glance. She's going to keep on walking down the stairs. She might even take her, if the rain stops, she'll close her umbrella. And this, again, gives it its charm and its agency. Here, one can see a couple of things. One, his kind of Whistlerian tonal color, when it's all very low-key and closely related, but also from Whistler, the use, all of the parts that here show up being a little bit like kind of like a burnt sienna, burnt orange color. That's really the wood. And that's where I put it back to coming from Whistler's use of the paper. The other big important sort of promenade in Venice is the Via Garibaldi. Via Garibaldi is, I've got so much anecdotal dumb stuff to tell you, but anyway, it's the only street in Venice that is called a via. It's a calle, a fondamenta, a riva, a ramo, but no vias. And the reason this is a via is because it was invented, literally invented by Napoleon's nephew, who was the viceroy of Venice on behalf of Napoleon. And he cleared out this whole area, built this great long promenade that led to the church of San Pietro di Castello that I showed you before. But here, it's an ordinary street. There's nothing all that glamorous. If you actually walk down a little further, you come to the great monumental gate that leads to the public gardens, and you can go to the Venice Biennale that way. But otherwise, it's an ordinary street with some of the exact same shops that were always there. The two shadows are accurate because it shows that it was high noon, etc. But what they're also telling you is that this part of the Via Garibaldi was originally a canal, and the edges of the canal are marked by the gray shadow part with the pavement on either side. So how much of this Morrice actually knew, we have no idea. But so often he shows things that suggest he knew a hell of a lot, or at least he read a lot. So again, they're never the big views. They're not monumental. They're not narratives. No one's doing anything here. They're just, the women are shopping. This person is, the woman at the right is just sitting there and doing nothing. It's la dolce far niente. And, but this painting drove me a little crazy because of that flag, because it's not a Venetian flag. Everything else about it is okay in terms of the Via Garibaldi. You have the right costume, etc. But the flag drove me crazy. However, thanks to some friends in Venice who did some research for me, having a flag of the Kingdom of Venice, a Kingdom of Italy. Italy is 1 year older than Canada. It was united in 1866, and there was a new flag. And the flags were very expensive, so you kept, and this part of the Via Garibaldi was not particularly wealthy. So if you had your flag, you kept it forever until it was into complete and utter tatters. It didn't really matter. So this is very legitimate as being a correct Venetian flag. But again, as with both pictures, there's nothing monumental about any of it. Another theme in the paintings you'll see in the exhibition are squares, which are not square. They're referred to as a campo, one campo, two campi. This is the Campo San Angelo, which is sort of halfway between the San Marco's over here, the Rialto's over there, and here's the Campo San Angelo, and then at the bottom, that's the end of Venice on that particular side. It's very unusual because he shows it. It is actually a square. It's huge, but he paints it as a diagonal. And this is very strange for Morrice because Morrice's favorite way of painting things is directly on. It's there in bands, and you know exactly where he is, and he's looking straight ahead. Here, he's looking across the campo at an angle. And in this case, we know he's standing because where he is, in order to see it that way, is this tiny, tiny little street, which leads to a bridge that goes over a canal. So if he were sitting, he'd block traffic. So in this case, he had to be standing. There's a lovely little dialogue going on between the child and her nursemaid, because again, she's wearing fancy clothes, the little kid, and the Popolano with her top knot and her brown shawl. One is trying to convince the other to go to, either to come play with me or let's go home. So it's a private dialogue. And again, with her turning her back to Morrice and by extension to you, that's their world and we're the observers in the same way that Morrice is. This is not our world. It's their world. What's funny about this picture, for me anyway, was in one of the sketchbooks, there's a tiny drawing of steps and columns. And they never made any sense because those should be, the drawing should be the kind of steps that you see leading into the water. But in order for that to happen, Morrice would have to be in the water. And the one thing we know from Morrice is that he never painted from a boat. And he never went in the water, so I never knew what it was. But then when I saw this panel, and then I realized it was a drawing for this, because unusual for most of Venetian campi, it's raised. And the reason it's raised is that it used to sort of function as a cemetery, because there was a church which has been destroyed. One of the things, by the way, that Napoleon did, one of the good things he did, was that he didn't allow any more burials in the city, because there was a tendency when Venice floods,
Yeah.
and occasionally Grandpa sort of flooded down too. I mean, your dead relatives might float by you. So he said enough of this and semi-invented the cemetery on the island of San Michele. In Campo Santo Stefano, he shows a very small section of one of the largest campi in Venice. And again, it's this making intimate and making familiar. The people, the two women on the left are walking up a street that will take them immediately, eventually. There's no straight lines in Venice, no straight streets, that's for sure. Will take them to the take them to San Marco, and the woman on the right is on her way to the Accademia Bridge, which will take her to the Accademia Museum in the eastern part of Venice. This is another motif in Morrice's work, not only of Venice, but of the woman, the older woman, because she's heavy set, in black, walking. She walks through Paris. She actually walks along Sherbrooke Street. She gets around, and here she's walking in this tiny little sliver of the Campo Santo Stefano. Morrice didn't exactly always paint a recognizable and famous monuments and famous places. I mean, the Campo San Angelo, Campo Santo Stefano are sort of, they're mini in a sense. They're almost as famous as Piazza San Marco. Here, old palaces, which it isn't a palace, it's a building, on the Fondamenta Briate. A fondamenta is a street that runs beside a canal with a wall. And this is probably a wine shop, and those bits of yellow, for lack of a better word, over the main doorway are not lights, but there's something. They're reflections of wooden supports that were barbacani, that were very typical of Venetian architecture. It allowed. Venice is built on water. It's built on trees which are in the water, which have petrified. And so space is very valuable. By having barbacane, you could probably get an extra meter or maybe a little bit more space, and you could extend the building out. And again, this is an example of only popolani, of just ordinary Venetians buying and going into the wine shop. This is also one of the rare occasions that he paints men. In most of his paintings, they're women, except they have male gondoliers. But here, just again, ordinary people. This took me a long time to find. I had an idea of where the site of this building was, but I wasn't sure, because it's in a part of the town that isn't quote unquote as historic, so people made changes. That building, which I think was a wine shop, had a certain life as a pet store, and I think more recently you can buy televisions in it. And so there have been changes which would never happen in buildings closer to San Marco, but the giveaway of exactly where it was just above the prow of the boat is the water outlet, the 12th century water outlet. And it's still there. And it's still there, and it's still in the same relationship to that building. That lamp is still there. The buildings that left haven't been changed. So he was, again, extremely, extremely accurate. Morrice didn't leave town. He didn't leave Venice very often. He did get on the Vaporetto, the steamboat, and he went to the Lido, which took probably 20 minutes at the most. And what makes him very different from anyone else of the other foreigners and photographers and tourists is he doesn't go to the resort side. The Lido is this long strip, as I say, to the east and leads to the Adriatic. On the Adriatic side, on the eastern side of the Lido, are where all the resorts were. They've all kind of gone, and the beaches and, were the famous part. Morrice doesn't get that far. He gets as far as where the boat docks from Venice on the western side. And this is a canal, the Canal San Nicolo de Lido, which leads to, behind it is the Church of San Nicolo, and in the exhibition is Morrice's painting of the church, but you see it from the side. This, and in a sense, is an archival document, because right now, the house, which is, we know it's not in Venice, because even the housing for the poorest people in Venice was very symmetrical. This isn't symmetrical at all. There's a description of it in a 1905 book called Life on the Lagoon, and it was where you could get a cheap meal. And it's completely gone, and now it's a highway and there's trucks. So this painting, which is so emblematic of I think, Morrice's empathy with Venetians. He paints it with the same dignity that he paints a palazzo. And it has this other role now as an archival document. And I know there's a very famous photograph of the canal and the building, but it wasn't a source for Morrice, because the photograph is looking down the canal, and here Morrice is being his typical self. He's on this bank of the canal and looking directly across. This is another, and it's in the exhibition with a wonderful blow-up, if you want to look at, see exactly how he lays the paint, with a panel and a canvas, and there's almost no difference. But what is different, and go and look at it, is the position of the child. She's the only thing that moves between the panel and
again, it's like
canvas.
he's creating that sense of urgency of the Campo painting that we looked at, that she's like, who's rushing who? Is she rushing her mother to finish the washing, or is,
presumably it's noontime. Her mother is doing washing clothes in the canal, which you could in those days because it was clean enough. And a docked boat, which means it's probably siesta, because they had to make a living, and so the boat would be delivering things if it weren't siesta. And the light is also that bright, high summer light, and absolutely quiet. And really, nothing's happening. I mean, she's washing clothes. That's it, and the kids are looking.
I think one of the other things you've talked to me about is the kind of virtuosity of a picture like Canal San Nicolo, because the way that the reflection, the way that he's orchestrated the reflection vis-a-vis the architecture above it is almost photographically accurate. Like there's no sort of spurious marks there, and yet it's a completely different painting style than above the waterline. So it's, two completely different types of painting within one picture.
And
really do
another
anything you
thing
wanted.
that he shows here, it shows in all of his paintings, is he's very subtle about the way that he paints. And I mean that is the way he lays on the paint. And he'll use different brush strokes, either thick, thin, or they're horizontal, vertical, to differentiate different textures. And so the surface gets its materiality from the paint. And the paint is important. The physical presence of the paint is what these pictures are really all about. And one of the things which you've maybe already noticed is what he loves to do with his, whenever he has water, whether it's a strip as it is in the Briati picture, or whether it's a wider thing such as in the San Nicolo, he loves to paint reflections. And he'll be the color is always the same, but of course the whole difference is in
Factor
the
is completely
brushstroke.
different, yeah.
And so the fact that the water is moving, it's moving because of the way he moves his brush. And that's what's important, is Morrice is a painter, and these paintings are about painting. And lastly, nobody knows if Morrice was ever, the documentation for Morrice being in Venice are the paintings, and that to me is what's 99.99999 the most important. There's a couple of letters that mention that Morrice is there. There's one letter to his friend Joseph Pennell about a painting that he paints for the Pennell is in the painting, and then I think Pennell etches Morrice. Joseph Pennell was American, but like Whistler, spent a lot of his life in Paris and spent a lot of his life in London, had a great reputation as an illustrator. He also, by the way, and I think influenced by both Morrice and Whistler, had a whole other life as a painter, but mainly like Whistler, using pastels. So staring at this illustration of the cafe on the Zattere is the southernmost promenade, the bottom of Venice. Okay? And there's this bald guy who's sitting in a chair, and he's obviously drawing the Church of the Redentore on the other side of the Giudecca Canal. Well, that's the drawing for his canvas, which is in a private collection, of the Redentore from the Zattere. So I think this is our one and only external evidence of Morrice in Venice. But you've got an exhibition of 60 paintings, so you know he was in Venice. Thank you.
Brava.